Money filled the mansion. But it could not fill her lungs. Nathaniel Crawford had built an empire before most men finished chasing one. His name moved markets in Manhattan, and his estate in Westchester reflected the precision of his ambition: sweeping glass walls, imported marble, curated silence. Investors trusted him. Competitors feared him. But none of that influence extended to the east wing of his own home, where machines hummed softly beside his mother's bed and time seemed to be slipping through carefully manicured fingers. Evelyn Crawford had once been the strongest person in any room she entered. She raised Nathaniel alone after his father died without warning, working long hours at a roadside diner before studying accounting at night. She taught him discipline before wealth, humility before success. Every contract he signed, every acquisition he conquered, had her fingerprints somewhere in its origin. Now she lay diminished beneath crisp white sheets, her breath shallow, her voice reduced to fragile murmurs doctors could not interpret. The decline had been gradual at first: unexplained fatigue, occasional confusion, small tremors dismissed as stress. But within months, her body betrayed her entirely. Specialists rotated through the mansion with quiet urgency. Neurologists debated rare degenerative syndromes. Immunologists ordered experimental panels. Nathaniel spared no expense. He converted an entire corridor into a private medical suite, installed advanced monitoring systems, flew in consultants from across the country. Yet every new opinion ended in uncertainty. No one promised recovery. No one offered clarity. Each evening, Nathaniel removed his suit jacket before sitting beside her, as though shedding the armor of the outside world. He spoke softly about business milestones, about expansions she once helped him imagine when he was only a boy with borrowed textbooks. He held her frail hand and waited for recognition in her eyes. Some nights, she seemed to understand. Other nights, she stared past him into spaces only she could see. The staff moved quietly in that wing. Nurses maintained professionalism. Doctors adjusted medication schedules. And somewhere beyond the polished floors and curated hallways, a cleaning lady named Marisol Reyes listened without being noticed. She had been hired to polish surfaces and disappear before sunset, but every afternoon she slowed near the east wing, drawn by something she could not ignore: the rhythm of machines, the faint whisper of a woman fading inside a house built on strength. And one afternoon, when the head nurse stepped out and Nathaniel was delayed in the city, Marisol paused outside that door longer than she ever had before. Because sometimes the impossible does not begin with medicine. It begins with listening. The machines tracked her heartbeat. But no one tracked her silence. Marisol Reyes had worked in large houses before. Wealth had a certain sound: polished floors echoing softly, distant voices filtered through intercom systems, doors closing gently instead of slamming. But illness carried a different sound. It hummed. It lingered. It pressed against walls long after footsteps faded. Every afternoon as she cleaned the west corridors of the Crawford estate, she heard the faint mechanical rhythm from the east wing, steady and unnatural, like breath borrowed from technology. She had never met Evelyn Crawford properly. The nurses handled the room. The doctors came and went with controlled urgency. Nathaniel passed through the hallway in tailored suits that looked too sharp for a house filled with decline. Marisol remained invisible by design, wiping surfaces, aligning decor, erasing fingerprints. Yet invisibility sharpens observation. And she had noticed something the specialists had not. Evelyn's whispers were not random. On the afternoon the head nurse stepped out to take a call and the wing fell briefly unmonitored, Marisol stood outside the half-closed bedroom door and listened carefully. Beneath the mechanical rhythm of oxygen support, beneath the soft clicking of monitors, there was a pattern in the frail murmuring. Not confusion. Not delirium. A repetition. A cadence that sounded less like deterioration and more like searching. Marisol hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender diffuser oil. Sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, illuminating the fragile outline of a woman who had once commanded strength. Evelyn's eyes were half open, unfocused, yet when Marisol approached the bedside, the whispering grew slightly clearer. A name surfaced between breaths. Not Nathaniel's. Not the nurse's. Thomas. Marisol felt something shift in her chest. The doctors had charted neurological decline. The nurses had recorded reduced cognitive response. But Marisol recognized the tone immediately. It was not confusion. It was longing. The kind that attaches to unfinished memory. She had heard it before in hospital rooms back in Miami when her own father drifted in and out of consciousness, calling for someone long gone. Evelyn was not slipping away randomly. She was reaching for someone. Marisol stood there longer than protocol allowed, absorbing the rhythm of that whisper, feeling instinct rise stronger than hierarchy. When the nurse returned, Marisol had already stepped back into the hallway, resuming her role as though she had never crossed the threshold. But now she knew something the charts did not reflect. Evelyn Crawford was not fading without direction. She was searching for Thomas. And the question that lingered in Marisol's mind was not medical. It was personal. Because no one in the Crawford household had mentioned that name in months, some names fade from conversation. But they never leave the heart. Marisol did not ask questions immediately. In large estates like the Crawfords, information traveled carefully, layered beneath discretion and hierarchy. But she had learned long ago that silence reveals more than direct inquiry. Over the next few days, she listened. Not intrusively. Not recklessly. Just enough to confirm what her instincts already suggested. Evelyn continued whispering the same name. Thomas. Not Nathaniel. Not a nurse. Not random syllables fractured by neurological decay. The name emerged with clarity each time, fragile but intentional, like someone reaching through fog toward something unfinished. The doctors interpreted the murmurs as cognitive regression. They adjusted medication. They increased sedatives at night, but Marisol heard memory. One afternoon, while polishing silver in the dining room, she noticed a framed photograph placed high on a distant shelf, a younger Evelyn standing beside a tall man with warm eyes and broad shoulders. The photo was older than Nathaniel's success, older than the estate itself. The caption beneath it read simply, Thomas Crawford, 1978. Marisol's hands stilled. Nathaniel's father. The man who had died decades ago. The house no longer displayed his presence openly. His office had been converted into a guest study. His belongings archived. Nathaniel rarely mentioned him. Success had required forward motion. Nostalgia had been quietly retired. Yet Evelyn was not calling into confusion. She was calling into history. That evening, Marisol lingered again near the east wing as Nathaniel stood beside his mother's bed, updating her on a merger that would double his company's valuation. His voice was calm, steady, hopeful. But Evelyn's eyes remained distant. Her breathing shallow. And once more, between pauses, the whisper surfaced. Thomas. Nathaniel did not react. He had likely stopped listening for meaning in those murmurs weeks ago. But Marisol had not. She began to understand something the specialists were missing. Evelyn's decline was not solely physical. It was emotional dislocation. The house had grown larger with Nathaniel's wealth, but smaller with unspoken memory. Thomas's absence had become architectural, removed from rooms, removed from conversation, removed from daily acknowledgement. And Evelyn, trapped inside a failing body, was reaching backward toward the last place she felt whole. Marisol stood alone in the hallway after the doctors left that night, her heart heavy with recognition. Because sometimes healing does not begin with new treatment. It begins with restoring what was taken away. And she was beginning to believe that the impossible would not come from medicine. It would come from memory. Grief had been archived. But she was still living inside it. The Crawford estate had grown larger over the years, expanding with Nathaniel's success. New wings were added, guest suites renovated, glass corridors installed to frame manicured gardens. But one room had remained untouched behind a locked oak door at the end of the west hallway. It had once belonged to Thomas Crawford, Evelyn's husband, Nathaniel's father, before his sudden heart attack reshaped their lives decades ago. Nathaniel had sealed it not out of cruelty, but preservation. He told himself that moving forward required minimizing backward weight. The office had been dusted monthly but never redesigned. Thomas's leather chair remained positioned near the mahogany desk. His old record player sat silent in the corner. Photographs were boxed and labeled, removed from public walls as the estate modernized around them. To Nathaniel, it was respect. To Evelyn, it had been erasure. Marisol discovered the room's existence accidentally while organizing seasonal linens. The housekeeper mentioned it in passing, a room rarely opened, a space belonging to before. That single word lingered with Marisol long after the conversation ended. Before. Before wealth. Before expansions. Before illness. That evening, as Nathaniel left for a late investor dinner, Marisol stood alone at the end of the hallway facing the oak door. She had no authority to enter it. No permission to interfere in family history. Yet she carried the sound of Evelyn's whisper in her memory like a quiet directive. Thomas. The key hung in a small drawer in Nathaniel's study, accessible, though rarely used. Marisol did not take it impulsively. She stood still for several long breaths, weighing risk against instinct. Then she made a decision not as an employee, but as someone who had once watched her own father deteriorate in a hospital bed while longing for things no doctor could prescribe. She unlocked the door. The air inside carried a faint scent of old paper and cedarwood. Dust motes floated in thin beams of evening light. The room felt suspended in time, untouched by modernization. A photograph rested on the desk, Thomas smiling beside Evelyn at a lakeside cabin, her hand gripping his arm with youthful certainty. Marisol stepped further inside, absorbing the quiet presence of a man whose absence had grown architectural within the estate. She understood then what the doctors had overlooked. Evelyn was not declining solely from biological failure. She was disoriented by emotional displacement. The house had grown around her, but the life she built within it had been quietly boxed away. Memory had been locked behind a door. And Marisol was beginning to believe that opening it might do what medicine could not. She closed the door gently behind her, already forming a plan. Because sometimes the impossible does not require new technology. It requires restoring what love once looked like. She wasn't asking for medicine. She was asking for yesterday. Marisol did not rush her plan. She understood that grief handled recklessly can wound deeper than illness. The next afternoon, while the nurses adjusted medication schedules and the estate moved through its disciplined rhythm, she returned quietly to Thomas Crawford's sealed office. This time, she did not simply observe the room, she searched it. Inside one of the desk drawers, beneath neatly stacked documents yellowed by time, she found what she had hoped for. A vinyl record labeled in careful handwriting, Evelyn's favorite, 1976. Beside it sat the old record player, still intact, its needle preserved though unused. The machine carried the weight of years, yet it remained functional, as if waiting. Marisol did not consider whether this crossed professional boundaries. She considered only the sound of Evelyn whispering Thomas's name into sterile air. She carried the record player carefully into the East Wing that evening while the head nurse prepared evening medications. The equipment was small enough not to disrupt machinery, quiet enough to blend into the hum of monitors. Evelyn lay motionless when Marisol entered, her breath shallow, her eyes half-lidded. Nathaniel had left early for a fundraising gala, confident that advanced care surrounded his mother. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and filtered oxygen. It did not smell like life. Marisol placed the record player on a side table and set the vinyl carefully on its surface. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered the needle. A soft crackle filled the room. Then music. Not modern. Not polished. But warm, the kind of melody that carries memory in its rhythm. A love song from the 1970s, slow and familiar, the kind played at lakeside cabins and wedding receptions long before corporate empires consumed calendars. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then Evelyn's breathing shifted. Subtly at first. A deeper inhale. A steadier rhythm. Her fingers, fragile and still for weeks, twitched slightly against the bedsheet. Marisol stepped closer, her heart pounding not with fear, but recognition. Evelyn's lips parted. And instead of whispering, "Thomas," into silence, she formed the melody's words faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if singing along to something only she fully remembered. The monitors registered minor fluctuations, not dramatic, not miraculous. But measurable. Marisol did not claim victory. She did not call for applause. She simply allowed the music to play, filling the sterile room with something it had not carried in months, familiarity. Evelyn's eyes opened wider than they had in weeks. And for the first time since her decline began, they focused. Not on machines. Not on ceiling lights. But on the space where Thomas once stood. The impossible had not happened. Yet something undeniable had shifted. And when Nathaniel returned home later that night, he would find his mother awake, not fully restored, not miraculously healed, but present. And he would demand to know how. He had prepared for goodbye. He walked into something else. Nathaniel Crawford entered the East Wing later than usual that night, still dressed in a tuxedo from a charity gala where he had pledged another 7-figure donation to medical research. The applause from that ballroom still echoed faintly in his ears as he loosened his bow tie, preparing himself for the quiet ritual he performed every evening, sitting beside a mother who no longer seemed to know he was there. But the room felt different before he even stepped inside. The air no longer carried only antiseptic and machine-filtered oxygen. There was warmth woven into it, faint music lingering like a memory suspended between walls. He paused in the doorway, his brow tightening slightly as he tried to locate the source. Then he saw her. Evelyn Crawford was not lying motionless against the pillows. Her eyes were open. Not drifting. Not vacant. Focused. Nathaniel froze where he stood, the careful composure he wore in boardrooms dissolving in a single breath. For weeks, he had braced himself for regression, for irreversible decline, for the slow surrender doctors spoke about in cautious tones. He had prepared for loss. He had not prepared for recognition. Her gaze shifted toward him. And though her body remained fragile, though tubes still traced across her skin and monitors hummed steadily beside her bed, there was awareness in her expression that had not existed in months. Marisol stood near the corner of the room, quiet, almost invisible as always. The record player had already been turned off. Only the echo of warmth remained. She did not step forward. She did not explain. She allowed the moment to belong to mother and son. Nathaniel moved closer slowly, as if afraid sudden motion might break something delicate. He knelt beside the bed, taking Evelyn's hand carefully in his own. The skin felt the same, thin, cool, familiar, but the response was different. Her fingers tightened faintly around his. Not a reflex. A response. Tears gathered in Nathaniel's eyes without permission. He had faced economic crashes, hostile takeovers, billion-dollar negotiations without trembling. Yet here, in the east wing of his own estate, he felt the ground shift beneath certainty. The monitors showed minor improvement, oxygen stabilization, steadier pulse. Nothing miraculous. Nothing dramatic enough to headline medical journals. But enough to defy the downward trajectory that had defined the past 3 months. Nathaniel turned his head slowly toward Marisol. He did not yet know what she had done. He only knew something had interrupted decline. And as Evelyn's lips parted slightly, forming not just a whisper but a word shaped with intention, Nathaniel realized this was not coincidence. This was intervention. And the woman standing quietly in the corner, the one he had barely noticed for months, was no longer invisible. Because sometimes the impossible does not look like a cure. It looks like presence. He trusted numbers. But this had no formula. Nathaniel did not sleep that night. He remained seated beside his mother's bed long after the nurses completed their rounds, long after the mansion quieted into its curated silence. Evelyn drifted in and out of light sleep, but each time she opened her eyes, there was awareness behind them. Not full strength. Not full clarity. But presence, unmistakable and steady. By morning, the physicians returned. They adjusted monitors, reviewed charts, examined neurological responses with clinical skepticism. Minor improvement, they called it. Temporary fluctuation. Possibly medication interaction. No one used the word recovery. No one allowed hope to inflate beyond caution. Nathaniel listened carefully. He had built his empire on measurable outcomes. Risk assessments. Probability curves. Controlled variables. Yet nothing in those charts explained what he had witnessed with his own eyes, the moment his mother's fingers tightened around his hand. The way her breathing synchronized with something deeper than machinery. He turned to Marisol privately later that afternoon. She stood in the corridor holding a folded stack of fresh linens, posture composed as always. She did not look like someone who had altered the trajectory of a multi-million-dollar medical effort. She looked like someone who had simply done her job. Nathaniel asked her what happened the night before. She did not exaggerate. She did not dramatize. She explained softly that Evelyn had been whispering Thomas's name repeatedly. That the house still carried his absence like an unspoken rule. That she found his old record and played the song they once loved. Nathaniel felt something tighten in his chest. He had locked that room to protect his mother from pain. He had removed reminders to prevent regression. He had modernized the estate as a symbol of forward motion. In doing so, he believed he was strengthening her environment. He had not considered that he might be dismantling her anchor. The doctors had treated symptoms. Marisol had treated memory. And in that realization, Nathaniel felt a rare kind of humility settle over him. Not humiliation. Not defeat. But recognition that wealth and intelligence are not omniscient. That evening, he unlocked Thomas Crawford's office fully for the first time in decades. He carried framed photographs back into the East Wing. He placed them where Evelyn could see them without straining her fragile body. He allowed the past to re-enter the house not as weakness, but as continuity. When the music played again, this time with Nathaniel sitting beside her intentionally, Evelyn's lips moved faintly with the melody. Not fading. Returning. Nathaniel looked toward Marisol standing quietly in the doorway and understood something he had never needed to learn before. Some things cannot be purchased. They must be remembered. And the impossible was no longer about curing illness. It was about restoring identity. The doctors called it stabilization. He called it a miracle he didn't pay for. Spring arrived quietly in Westchester. The East Wing of the Crawford estate no longer felt like a waiting room for goodbye. The machines remained, but their urgency had softened. Evelyn still required care, still moved carefully through each day, but she no longer drifted in silent detachment. She spoke in fragments. She smiled faintly when old photographs were placed within her view. And when music filled the room, her fingers traced invisible patterns against the sheets as though remembering dances long past. Nathaniel adjusted the estate without announcing it publicly. Thomas Crawford's office was restored rather than archived. The record player found a permanent place in the East Wing. Family photographs returned to hallways once stripped of nostalgia. The house no longer projected only forward ambition, it held history again. And in that subtle transformation, Evelyn's decline slowed in ways doctors cautiously described as unexpected stabilization. But Nathaniel understood something deeper. His mother had not been losing only strength. She had been losing connection. Marisol never claimed credit. She continued her work as before, polishing surfaces, organizing shelves, moving through the mansion with quiet humility. Yet Nathaniel noticed her now. Not as staff. Not as background. But as someone who saw what others overlooked. He raised her salary without ceremony. He offered private thanks not wrapped in grandeur. He learned her story, a daughter of immigrants, a former caregiver to her own ailing father, a woman who understood that illness does not erase the heart's orientation. One afternoon, as sunlight poured through the east wing windows, Evelyn asked for something unexpected. Not medicine. Not rest. She asked for the music. Nathaniel placed the vinyl carefully onto the record player, lowering the needle with hands steadier than before. The melody filled the room once more, warm and imperfect. Evelyn closed her eyes, not in retreat, but in recognition. And when she opened them again, she looked directly at her son. Fully. The moment was quiet. Not dramatic. Not cinematic in spectacle. But profound in truth. Nathaniel felt something settle inside him that no acquisition had ever delivered, the realization that love cannot be optimized. It cannot be streamlined or modernized without cost. It must be preserved. Marisol stood near the doorway as always, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. She did not need applause. She did not need acknowledgement beyond the small nod Nathaniel offered her that afternoon, a nod heavy with gratitude and humility. The impossible had not been curing disease. It had been restoring memory. And in the end, the millionaire learned what medicine alone could not teach him, that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from innovation, but from returning someone to who they were before the world tried to move them forward too quickly. Evelyn Crawford did not become the woman she once was entirely. But she became present. And in that presence, the mansion felt like a home again.